Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello and welcome to a special January 6th edition of the Week-to-Week Political Roundtable from the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipperer, your host for Week to Week and the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. Now we're gathered here virtually at the beginning of a new year. And the reason for this special program is because of something I suspect will go on commemorating for years to come. I refer, of course, to the NFL playoffs. And as someone who grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, I was pleased yesterday when I saw the term Green Bay sweep trending on Twitter, because I was sure it referred to the Green Bay Packers sweeping the NFL playoffs. Could still happen, but it turns out the term actually refers to the plan by former Trump aide Peter Navarro to reverse the results of the presidential election. I'm sure the Vikings would like to reverse the results of Sunday's game against the Packers. That's not going to happen. But today we're going to talk about whether reversals in American elections and even democracy itself is possible or even probable. So let's get started by meeting our panelists. First, Melissa Cain is a political analyst and attorney and a frequent week-to-week panelist. Welcome back, Melissa.
Thanks for having me.
Joining our panel for the first time, but no stranger to the Commonwealth Club, is Dr. Francis Fukuyama, Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy. You can follow him on Twitter at Fukuyama Francis. So welcome, Frank. Good to have you with us. And last, but definitely not least, is Tim Miller. He's a contributor to The Bulwark, an MSNBC political analyst, host of Not My Party on Snapchat. You can follow him on Twitter at TimoDC. Hello again, Tim.
Hey, John.
So let's get started. 1 year and just a couple hours ago, I was on a Zoom staff meeting, as many of us are these days, and one of my colleagues texted me that there was a crowd attacking the US Capitol. And so I became one of millions of Americans and people around the world watching with disbelief as the situation unfolded right before our eyes, getting worse by the hour. So in his speech this morning, President Joe Biden said that Donald Trump prepared for January 6th for months, building up the big lie about a stolen election. Tim, I want to start with you. What do we know about what led up to January 6th in terms of planning or actions that were taken?
Significant amount. I think this is the most relevant part as we look back on it a year out, because I think that a lot of folks, particularly on the right, particularly my former, colleagues and what used to be the establishment of the Republican Party, want to downplay this for obvious reasons, right? Like want to kind of provide a cover story that this was a one-off, that this, was kind of a rally that got out of hand, that this was not a legitimate attempt to overturn our democracy, that we shouldn't overreact. We shouldn't be commemorating it in this way. You've seen a lot of commentary to that effect today on the center right, and that's just not true. The events of January 6th were an inevitable consequence of a series of actions that the then president of the United States was taking, along with an entire media ecosystem that supported him. There was a Stop the Steal tour, that had members of Congress participate in it, that had a official podcast run by the president's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon. There were efforts within the state legislatures. Obviously, the president was lobbying various state legislatures to overturn elections in their states. Obviously, that there were the works being done in the courts. We've later learned in the Department of Justice, there were officials looking for ways to overturn the election. Jeffrey Clark. And as you pointed out, John, in the lead, I'm working for next week on an article for The Bulwark about Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro and their so-called Green Bay sweep. They planned it out in the open. They admitted that they planned it out in the open, that their strategy was maybe kind of dumb, which I think is why, some people want to minimize it today. It was not a plan that was very likely to work given how much Joe Biden won the election by. But it was a real plan, and they wanted to buy enough time to send, to challenge the election results, send the results back to the states, in the hopes that that some of these states, there would be enough gridlock that it would throw the election to the House of Representatives, where Republicans had a majority of states. I think that both the plan to overturn the election was multifaceted, in addition to the incitement and the riling up of millions of people to convince them that the election was being stolen from them, that they should show up on the Capitol that day to try to pressure the vice president. That was a concerted, media and communications effort. So it was multi-pronged, and to be honest, all of that, despite what happened on January 6th, all of that at different varying levels is ongoing today. And there remain millions of people who believe that the election was stolen from them. Donald Trump continues to tell them that. And, we are certainly not, out of the woods. This anniversary is not an end date to look back at something in the past. It's a look at something that's ongoing.
Frank, you wrote in the New York Times this week, quote, "The Republican Party, far from repudiating those who initiated and participated in the uprising, has sought to normalize it and purge from its own ranks those who were willing to tell the truth about the 2020 election as it looks ahead to 2024, when Mr. Trump might seek a restoration," unquote. Could you talk a bit more about that and maybe give us a kind of, on the heels of what Tim just said, give us a bit of a report card on the health of this party and the system as far as dealing with this kind of an insurgency?
Well, the report card for the Republican Party is an F, or I don't know if you can get a lower grade than an F. And that's really the most discouraging thing. These incidents have happened of extremism in the past. It's not the first time that you've had kind of right-wing nationalists that have done crazy things. You had Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. You had Richard Nixon trying to abuse the system. But in those prior cases, basically the adults in both of those earlier ones, the adults in the Republican Party eventually decided enough is enough, and we're going to have to repudiate those actions. In Nixon's case, they walked away such that he, was forced to resign. What's happened is the opposite this time around. A number of Republicans, Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, all condemned what had happened on the day itself. But then one by one, they all flipped in the coming days and months and started to minimize the attack or claim that it was actually inspired by Antifa or all these other, ridiculous theories. And the reason they were doing it was not that they actually believed any of this. They saw that the Republican base had been completely converted by Donald Trump into this false belief in this false narrative about the stolen election. I think the single biggest challenge that we face, which is an ongoing constitutional crisis, is the fact that Republican legislators in many states like Texas, Florida, Arizona, and so forth are changing the laws in a couple of ways. I mean, they're trying to restrict access to the vote, especially on the part of African Americans and other likely Democratic voters, and they're trying to change the rules under which the electoral slates will be determined in the next presidential election that would basically award themselves the ability to overturn a popular vote. So in other words, they're planning a repeat. Not only have they not repudiated January 6th, they're actually planning, for a contingency where they may have to do it again in 2024. And this time they won't fail because they'll have appointed all of the key election officials with loyalists. And that's really I think the clear and present danger that the country is in right now.
Melissa, I know you've been researching and delving further into the U.S. Constitution, but what safeguards are there that might be used to prevent such a future thing? Or what built-in elements there are, if you will, exacerbating some of these problems, kind of going on the heels of the issue of the states having kind of so much responsibility and control over the elections for many reasons. Is there stuff that Congress can do without changing the Constitution? Or, can they protect the votes of people who need to vote? Can they, change the way states, select their electoral votes?
Well, to some degree, yes, but they don't have carte blanche to do that kind of thing. And I don't want to put words in Dr. Fukuyama's mouth about this, but I think in terms of a constitutional crisis, the issue is that the Constitution does not really provide guardrails. It just says the states will figure out the electors and let us know. And in part, that was because at the time, remember, the Constitution itself was basically sort of a power grab at the time from the states. And so they couldn't be too heavy-handed with the states. And so they really gave the states a lot of leeway and to determine how they come up with their electoral college votes. And so however the states do it is kind of, going to be left alone unless it runs into a particular right under, sort of various amendments to the Constitution. So for example, we had certain voting rights laws that were in place to protect African Americans because there was an equal protection problem when basically the Congress had found that there was a violation of people's federal rights and under certain state laws. And so they were allowed to sort of intervene there. But aside from sort of demonstrated instances of disenfranchisement that violate equal protection laws or other kinds of rights under the Constitution, there really isn't a lot of place for the federal government to step in. Now, they've tried to in the past, and they are trying to right now with a bill that's been held up that I think there's going to be a renewed push for, but that will probably be challenged legally as well. And so the crisis may be the fact that there aren't a lot of guardrails in the Constitution, and the push may be to put some of that into the Constitution and maybe give the federal government a little more power when it comes to state rules around, the nitty-gritty of Election Day.
Recently, former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown told the New York Times that San Francisco's vaunted Democratic Party machine has no bench. It has lots of people with ideas, but none able to carry them out after, I guess after the mayor, there's kind of like a weak bench. Tim, speaking nationally, is the Democratic Party up to the task of waging what could be a long-lasting battle for the heart and soul of America?
I'm concerned about that. I think that that in some ways there's kind of this parallel to I think what a lot of climate activists feel, right? That we're in this existential crisis, and that sometimes the Democratic politicians pay lip service to the fact that we're in an existential crisis, but then their actions don't sort of meet that. I think that there's a parallel here to I think how a lot of us who are deeply concerned about democracy and in this country feel that we are facing right now a very dangerous moment looking ahead to the 2024 election and 2028 elections, and that Democrats in Washington in a lot of cases are like going along with it as business as usual, and I feel like that this moment calls for a party that is both A, extremely aggressive and pushing back against the authoritarian threat, but B, welcoming and broad to people that are part of a pro-democracy coalition and willing to, maybe sacrifice some of, what your typical interest group DC politics, in service of maintaining a broad popularity so that they can keep out Donald Trump. You look at Hungary, for example, there's an election coming up this year. I defer to Dr. Fukuyama on this as the expert, but this coalition of literally like quasi-fascists and socialists and free marketers and moderates, who are all pushing back against Orban, and I would like to see that here. And it doesn't feel like the Democratic Party is trending that direction. The other thing is just to speak to the point Melissa was bringing up is that there are some narrow things on vote counting that the Democrats could do. And, you look at, there was an 1876 election that got thrown to the House. And after that, they wrote this really convoluted electoral count act that helped people figure out how we go about counting the votes. This doesn't address some of what Dr. Fukuyama was talking about voting rights, but it does address maybe our more pressing, urgent threat, which is that there is a repeat of 2020 and 2024, and that the Republicans try to monkey with the count. And I think that sometimes maybe sacrificing the perfect not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and making some changes and adding whatever safeguards we can within, the scope of the power that Democrats have right now, I think would be smart, because the clock is ticking on that. We're about 11 months away from very likely the Democrats not being able to do anything about this.
Actually, if I could interject, as a political scientist, it seems to me pretty clear that the single biggest political threat we face in America right now is the attempt to corrupt the integrity of future elections, and that really ought to be the overriding objective of the Democrats, and then of any Republicans that are actually still on board with protecting American democracy. The problem they face, though, is that what may be clear to an activist or to a political scientist is just not clear to a lot of Americans. This is not at the top of anybody's list, of things that need to be done. They're worried about crime, they're worried about inflation, they're worried about, the border, they're worried about a lot of other issues. And the coming midterm elections and the 2024 election is not going to be won by a kind of resounding support for future electoral integrity. That's just not what's going to win the Democrats' elections. And so, in a sense, the stakes could never have been higher as to how these elections are going to, turn out. But the grounds on which they're going to be contested are going to be sort of politics as usual, because that's really, how ordinary voters are thinking about things. And so, it's a very difficult kind of tactical question for the Democrats to negotiate as to how much emphasis they want to give this issue, which objectively is important, but as a practical political matter may not be their path to power.
Melissa, could you talk a bit about that? I mean, the Democratic Party, we've seen the Republican Party obviously going through this pro-Trump purity movement for the past year and before that, but it's really the big lie version of it for the past year. And I mentioned at a previous Week to Week program, I think it was the head of the Illinois Republican Party or some high official there. They were asked if they were, what sort of litmus test they would have for candidates. And they said something like, oh, we're not going to have a litmus test, but we are going to, they will be asked, do you believe the 2020 election was stolen? Talk a bit about politically in the Democratic Party and their own purity push that they've had, and obviously after 2 years now of racial upheaval, of a lot of racial reckoning going on, as well as other things that really has amplified the progressive wing of the party, and is that making it impossible or very difficult for the folks who do want to be able to work with the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Kinzingers and others to get kind of a new center that can really kind of solidify or protect democracy?
Well, so at least in swing districts or districts that are a little more up in the air, we still don't really know what the districts are going to look like since the census. Everybody's, I think, still drawing and accepting changes. But it seems like for Republicans, right, a lot of them have to thread a needle, right? You want to appeal to the energy maybe of the Trump voters, but also you don't want to lose independents or people who are more traditionally conservative, right? So how do you do that? Well, one way to do that, one way to get all of those people aligned with you as a Republican is to have a really good campaign against your Democrat opponent, right? Because people often vote for somebody because they're not somebody else, right? So to the extent that Democrats are giving Republicans very juicy targets to amass support on the other side from, that is probably not that helpful. And so you might see someone who, like, for example, the governor of Virginia, who just really made the election about and was able to win in Virginia by making the election really about his Democrat opponent, and was able to sort of line up a maybe unlikely coalition, behind him. And so that kind of thing may prevent some Trump supporting candidates or politicians from really facing a reckoning within their own party by sort of constantly being able to turn the spotlight elsewhere and talk about defunding the police and some of the other, kind of ideas that really, to Dr. Fukuyama's point, are really top of mind for voters. And so Democrats may not be doing themselves many favors in certain districts by sort of allowing the other side to line up against them.
Let's talk about the January 6th committee, the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack. Here at the Commonwealth Club, we've had programs in the past year separately with committee members Liz Cheney, Zoe Lofgren, and we heard about the committee's goals and processes. And there were complaints toward the end of 2021 about, well, what are they doing? Are they doing anything? They need to be more aggressive. And then right near the end of the year, we started getting a slew of subpoenas and, talk of criminal contempt and such. I'd like to hear from each of you, and start with you, Melissa, just stick with you first. But what do you think of the work of the committee so far? And then kind of what do you think we can expect in this next, they say they hope to have an initial draft perhaps out of a report in summer and then a final report in fall. What do you think of their work so far, and what do you think we can expect before they wrap it up?
I think there's been some criticism that the indictments, for example, so far have been really against, and these are indictments by the DOJ, not the committee, but that there have been a lot of indictments against the sort of folks who were there and stormed the Capitol, sort of rightfully so, but that the people who called for it, the people who sort of arranged for it, the people who planted those seeds and incited it, have yet to be really called out or charged with anything for their involvement. And so one of the things the committee has done is really uncover a lot of that involvement. I can't tell you what's going to happen because every day something is bananas. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I did not see those text messages coming. That was crazy. So it seems like every time we peel, something comes out that is just wow. And so, it's hard to know because the whole thing is just kind of bonkers. But, I think a lot of people are watching to see what the committee can do to inform charges against or expose people who are not there necessarily in the Capitol, but people who are sort of behind this effort. I think that's what people are sort of looking to this committee to help with.
Frank, what's your take on the committee and its work?
Well, there was a poll, I forget by Pew or what organization, in the past week about whether people were actually following the committee's work and whether they had been persuaded by any of the evidence that had come out that there was actually an active conspiracy. And it was very discouraging because there didn't seem to be much movement on that front, that if you believe the election was stolen or you're a Trump supporter, almost nothing that the committee had put forward had really changed your mind. So this is part of this phenomenon of motivated reasoning that's been plaguing our politics, that you want to believe something and you can't be deterred by any amount of empirical evidence away from that. Now, that's today. I do think, however, that there may be such an accumulation of further facts that will come out that it will penetrate, to some extent. You're obviously not going to get the hardcore MAGA supporters, but, there are a lot of people that are not heavily committed in that direction that may still be, approachable by evidence. That would be the hope. And I think the committee probably could do a lot more to get some of this stuff out there. I mean, they've been talking about holding the hearings in prime time, and that might, that might work.
Tim, what about you?
Yes, I've wanted to give the committee some leeway to do their job. I thought that they not this committee, but Congress made a mistake by not rushing through the second impeachment. I think that there might have been a window where they could have gotten more Republican votes before all the Republican senators realized that their voters, wanted them to stand with Trump or whatever. You saw this change in the Lindsey Grahams of the world over the course of the week. I think it was so clear what happened on January 6th. You didn't need to do investigation, and possibly they could have rushed through an impeachment. Once that window was missed, now I think the January 6th committee has to actually do their job. And I was encouraged by the subpoena, and get all the facts that they can get. I was encouraged by the subpoenas. some of this is going to take longer than people want. Bannon obviously stands in contempt of court, for one example. He's not going to, that trial isn't, I don't think, till July, right? So, you have to be patient with some of this stuff. What I've heard is that they've gotten better cooperation than you might think out of some people from within the White House. And I think their main job now is to detail for the public, just how unconscionable the former president's actions were on that day. Because I think there's a lot we don't know still about what President Trump was doing between, his speech on the Mall and, that very, very late video that came out, kind of half praising the rioters, half telling them to go home. And so I think their job is to, hold as many of the organizers as they can accountable, to Melissa's point, and focus on them, to reveal as much as they can about Trump's actions that day. And to publicize that and use that as a cudgel against all of those that have been enabling them. That's this committee's job over the next 10 months. If they do that well, then I think we can look back and think this is a worthwhile endeavor. If we're in the same place, in October that we are today, I think we'll feel like it didn't do its purpose.
Melissa, talk about the Justice Department's role in this. As was mentioned, there's stuff the committee can do and can recommend, but they're of course not prosecuting people. The Justice Department, I guess, is prosecuting more than 700 defendants, said to be the largest prosecution in its history. Do you think just literally the prosecution of those 700 people will have some deterrent effect, at least from the folks who, are kind of on the Johnny Tremaine cosplay sort of wing of the country?
Well, I mean,
or does it matter, like as I said by someone else, it doesn't matter that they're not going after the ringleaders, they're not going after the planners and the financiers, et cetera?
Well, I mean, all that is going to help, but even just for the people on the ground, I mean, one of the things that's really kind of startling about a lot of these charges is that, sort of defacing federal property and attempting to, with criminal intent, impede federal proceedings and official proceedings. These are charges that carry 10 years up to 20 years in prison as punishment. And so they have a pretty big stick to wield to get folks to plead out or to negotiate a deal. And what you've seen is, because these penalties are pretty dramatic, potentially, that people have really groveled, frankly, in front of federal judges saying, I'm so, I lost my mind. I was following Donald Trump. That's been a big defense, as I was doing what my president told me to do. So how can it possibly be an interference with federal proceedings? And that's been an interesting one as well, but really forcing them to very publicly state that they were wrong and that they, were mistaken and that, that it did not have the desired effect, et cetera. It can't hurt to have, the people who were that fired up be forced to at least make the argument, whether it's genuine or not, that they suffered from some kind of temporary insanity. So you got to believe that it didn't hurt. It might not have helped as much as people would have liked, but I think at least going after the rank and file, for starters, is something that I know people watching, people like me who are totally horrified by what happened, are like, good, I'm glad to see, that people are being dealt with who were actually the ones breaking and defiling our Capitol.
I just want to add one thing that I have a very minor disagreement with that. I think that the people that were breaking the Capitol and defiling the Capitol and the people that were rioting, should be held to account with the law. I do worry a little bit about the overemphasis on this, and we'll see how it plays out in a year. So far, I think the person that has gotten the longest sentence, was the dude with the horns, and
shaman.
The shaman. And it's like, to my knowledge, the shaman didn't actually physically attack anyone. What he did was totally inappropriate, right? But the shaman is not the problem here, right? I mean, the shaman was a victim in some cases of a lie that was being perpetrated by the people that wanted to stay in power. And so anyway, it's where I agree with Melissa, is that I think that if we end up in a place where it's only the shaman types that get punished, I think that there'll rightly be, a lot of anger about that, because that the threats that we face, are coming from those, who are stoking this, the Ali Alexanders and the Alex Joneses and the Matt Gaetzes and the people in Congress and the Steve Bannons. And some of these, and then, there were the organized groups like the Oath Keepers. Those folks should all be held accountable. But, some of these folks were, are at some level victims of all of those people's menacing actions.
Frank, talk, if you will, about the international reaction to this and what it means and perhaps portends for the United States leadership of kind of any movement worldwide.
Well, sure. So this is part of a larger global phenomenon of the weakening of democracy. Freedom House, the organization that tracks this, has noted that for 15 years in a row, the aggregate amount of democracy in the world has fallen. And particularly in the last year because of what's been going on in the United States and India. And, you can see other countries picking up these bad practices of contesting what were otherwise free and fair elections. This happened last summer in Peru. The populist president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is threatening to do that. If he loses the election, he'll behave just like Trump did. But the thing that worries me the most actually is the geostrategic consequences. Part of this anti-democratic global movement is the rise of two big authoritarian powers, Russia and China. Both of those countries have territorial claims on other democracies, on Ukraine in Russia's case, and on Taiwan in the case of China. And they've been, preparing possibly for military action. And I actually don't think it's an accident that you've had this huge buildup of Russian military forces on Ukraine's borders a year after this January 6th event. Let me just read you this quotation from a Russian observer that was published just recently. He said, "Even though the weakening of the West has been going on for some time, the current crisis indicates that the process has moved to a qualitatively new level, and it would therefore be foolish not to seize the opportunity." In other words, the correlation of forces has shifted. Russia feels strong and confident, and they look at things like the Capitol uprising and the continued polarization in the United States, and they say, look, the United States can't pass a budget. They can't basically work their way out of a paper bag. And this is the opportunity to do things that we've been wanting to do for a long time, but felt we couldn't because the balance of power was not in our favor, and now it is. And so I think that this is a direct connection between our domestic polarization, the delegitimization of democracy and of American democracy, and the weakening of the American geopolitical position in the world as a whole. And I'm very, very worried about that.
That obviously impacts whatever the current administration can do internationally. I want to talk a bit about domestically. In an AP story this week, White House officials insisted that President Biden's relative silence, quote, should not be interpreted as complacency with the growing movement to rewrite history surrounding the January 6th riot. They say the president believes the most effective way to combat Trump, election denialism, and domestic extremism is to prove to the rest of the country and to the world that government can work, unquote. So, Tim, we're toast then, right? I mean, if that's what I think is going to protect democracy is...
we're relying on government working to save the democracy? Yeah, look, I've been sympathetic to Biden's position on this. He ran on uniting the country. He was, when a lot of people mocked him that was the theme of his campaign early in the Democratic primary and said this was ridiculous, he stayed the course. It paid off for him. It turned out that there was a silent majority in this country that was tired of all the nonsense, that just wanted a steady hand, and that worked for him. And so I think that you can't then get into the White House and start, running a flamethrower campaign against Republicans. So I think that he's been very prudent in the way that he's dealt with the Trump issue, talking about it on occasion, but not really that often, not at all akin to how Trump talked about Obama and Bush and other, and his Democratic opponents. I think he's been very open to trying to get bipartisan things done, the COVID stimulus, and then didn't end up being, but then, the infrastructure bill did. And so, I've respected that point of view. I thought that his pivot today to a much more direct attack on Trump was really appropriate. I don't feel like he was getting the credit that he deserved, frankly, from either the media or the right, for the fact that he's pulled a lot of punches and done his best to kind of offer an olive branch. It didn't seem like he was getting any credit for that, which I think is outrageous, to be honest. He deserves a lot of respect for the way that he handled himself and comported himself after, just the awful mess that he was dealt by his predecessor. But now we're looking ahead to a midterm year. And so I don't think that he should obsess about Trump and talk about him every day. But I think a clear, resolved message about what it is, about the threats that are coming from the right, is necessary. And I think he's got to do that. And also, to Frank's point, run a competent government on popular issues that are normal politics, dealing with inflation, dealing with COVID. That's a big job. It's really hard. But given the stakes here, he's got to figure out a way to do both well this year. And I think that they obviously hit some speed bumps last year in the competent government side of things, in sort of the period from Afghanistan through inflation and Delta and the fallout.
Melissa, talk a bit more, if you would, about the impact of the insurrection and the former president who would not go away, who would not exit the news cycle. How has that impacted President Biden's first year?
Well, to some degree, it's not just Donald Trump who's out there keeping himself in the headlines. I mean, we've seen Democrats, maybe to excess, really keep talking about him in their campaigns. In California, right here, we had, the recall election, and it was the Trump recall, basically, is how Governor Newsom's campaign styled it. I thought a little unnecessarily. I mean, you can attack the recall, but without attacking Trump, but whatever. Anyway, that was how they went about it. And he, of course, Newsom won overwhelmingly, but then you saw in other places like in Virginia, where a reliance, maybe an over-reliance on sort of tying this person to the party of Trump, your Republican opponent to the party of Trump, did not answer the questions about, sort of local issues that people were concerned about. And so not only has Trump managed to keep himself in the news, but I think Democrats have, maybe excessively kept him in the news as well in their efforts to, to paint the Republican Party as sort of just the party of Trump, which in some cases, I'm sure is true, but maybe at the expense of very specific issues that people care about.
In looking at where things could develop or how they could develop, I want to start by noting that something like 15 years ago, Christianity Today magazine, so an evangelical Protestant magazine, ran an article asking if evangelicalism was descending into folk religion, meaning forsaking doctrine and orthodoxy and basically becoming more of just whatever you think, that's it. It's as long as you call yourself a Christian and vote for the hard right stuff. I kind of wanted to apply that to the Republican Party. I mean, we all remember when the Republican Party, whether you agreed with it or disagreed with it, was a party with very serious thinkers, and I mean, it was really exciting sometimes to either be a part of or to watch these discussions and debates go on within conservative circles. I mean, Tim, start with you. I mean, is the Republican Party salvageable as a party of ideas and as a platform, or are they just like the American version of United Russia?
Yeah, salvageable is tough because long term, yes, hopefully the country needs to have two functioning parties. I think it probably will never really look like it did before, and it might look more like kind of a European nationalist conservative party than the sort of classically liberal party that was what the Republicans were more akin to here. But right now in the short term, no. And I got this big laugh last week when I saw Breitbart, which is the home to like the MAGA nationalist, media site, ran a headline about how David McCormick was going to be the MAGA candidate in the Pennsylvania Senate primary. Now, this is a guy that runs one of the biggest hedge funds in the world, maybe the biggest. His wife is Dina Powell, who went to serve in the Trump administration. I mean, he in any other era, if you just listen to a person like this talk, would sound like any other Wall Street kind of Republican: deregulation, tax cuts, socially moderate, lives in the New York City, right? But that now all these folks, have to position themselves as being MAGA. The nice thing is MAGA doesn't mean anything, right? Like all it means is that you're for Trump. And to your friend at the Illinois party's comment that you're willing to say that you're concerned that there might be some irregularities about the election and that you're concerned about the border, right? Like that's it. Like those are the issues. Those are the issues. And besides that, it's sort of a grab bag. And so, in that sense, the current Republican Party is very nihilistic. It's a party that is all about power, and it's centered around this one person. And there's not really any room for kind of intellectual. There's no point in any intellectual debate because it doesn't really matter where people fall on various things as long as they're right on the two major tenets of the faith.
I'm reminded of President Eisenhower's 1956 statement that we've all seen circulate on social media. Quote, "If a political party does not have as its foundation does not have its foundation in the determination to advance a cause that is right and that is moral, then it is not a political party. It is merely a conspiracy to seize power." Frank, are we seeing this come true in this party?
Well, something much more bizarre is going on. If you look at the role that anti-vaxxers are playing in the party right now, for many Republicans, that is the central issue. And how opposition to vaccines, a vaccine that was developed, in the Trump administration, how that came to be seen as so critical to so many conservatives, I think is not explainable through any kind of sociological analysis. It's certainly not something that derives from Republican principles. I think you really have to go to something like social psychology to understand it, that it's become such a marker of conservative identity that nobody can break from that without undermining that identity. And one of the absolutely fascinating things that's happened in the last couple of weeks is that Trump himself, on several occasions, has said, I got vaccinated, and I think he admitted to being boosted as well. And he said that everybody should be, and that he got booed at one of his rallies, And so it's like he's created this monster that he himself can't even control at this point, that is just kind of spinning out of control, completely divorced from any kind of underlying ideology that used to define conservatism.
Actually, if I could jump in on this as well, I mean, of course, agree with everything the other two panelists have said. I'm hoping, and I've been saying this for a long time, but so I don't know that it might just be me wishful thinking, but I have had a bee in my bonnet about political parties for quite a while. And, questions about why states are involved in political primaries at all, which are party functions and not really state functions, and often cost money to taxpayers, even though they're not a part of the party. I think, having large numbers of people disaffected from either party, and Gallup numbers are out. It looks like nationwide what's happening is something that we've seen in California for a long time, which is that the Republican Party is shrinking, but the Democratic Party isn't growing. It's just creating a huge number of people, some 40-something% of people who don't identify with either party. And those people eventually will be, such a mass that they have to go somewhere. And so asking questions about why political parties are so entrenched, why states sort of certify and sort of get involved with and pay for primary elections, why not have open primaries? I mean, questions about the strength of political parties and, why it's so hard to get on ballots, and maybe investigating, how to get on ballots in regions or nationwide is something that people will increasingly turn to as the Republican Party, sort of shrinks, but becomes this small, very, very particular group of folks.
A year or so ago, USC political science professor Dan Schnur was asked on this program about Governor Newsom's leadership during the pandemic. He was being criticized at the moment, kind of getting rocky there for a while. And he said there's both an issue of good leadership, but also what he called the need for good followership. Tim, and maybe this goes back to my comment about kind of folk religions and populism. Does it matter what people in think tanks and on NPR and in public forums like the Commonwealth Club and in academia think and say when, this can sound so elitist, but I'll swing with it. When the masses aren't listening to them and don't care, it's still coming down to how much I'm paying for gas, and he entertains me, so I voted for him.
I don't want to burst anybody's bubble here, but I do not know that this panel is going to be what saves our democracy. I don't know that it matters to the extent to which it matters, but it doesn't hurt. But I don't know how much it helps. Look, I do think with the Republican Party, there certainly is a bottom-up problem. And it speaks right to Dr. Fukuyama's point there about the vaccines, right? I think that that you saw this moment last year, that we've been talking about, where Republicans started acting normal and saying the things that we've all wanted them to say. That was so refreshing for a minute to hear Mitch McConnell talk as if he was living in the same reality that we all were. But the problem was they've all had to back away because that's not how the reality of their voters saw. And so there is this bottom-up, issue where the people that are trying to nudge voters in the right direction end up getting pushed out. And you've seen this. I'm very concerned. Liz Cheney is a prime example. It's that I was always a rhino moderate Republican. She was a hardline conservative. I didn't like her. We were on opposite sides of the party. We fought. But now she is out because she goes against one of the planks of the faith. And so, how do leaders nudge the right direction? I'm always hesitant to say nothing matters. I do think that we've seen a lot of cowardice. And I think that there have been a lot of Republican leaders who maybe had the opportunity to nudge enough of their voters the right direction. Maybe you can't get to, the most dogged adherents of the faith, but that you could get to enough of the voters, to move things, right? I said that, look, had Joe Biden, had enough Republican leaders gotten behind Joe Biden that he won instead of, narrowly in 3 states, he won, closer to a George H.W. Bush 88 style landslide, Trump would be gone. It wouldn't matter whether 20% of the people really wanted a Trump dictatorship because the numbers would have been so in their disfavor. So I do think their leadership matters. People's actions matters. History is contingent. But right now, the power in the Republican Party is not within the leaders. It's coming bottom up from the voters.
A few months ago, George Will was at the Commonwealth Club. He was in a conversation with Tim's Bulwark colleague, Jonathan Last. And George Will was asked about the problems he was talking about the problems in England when gin became cheap and plentiful and was having all these deleterious effects on family and work and such. And they passed some laws to try to deal with the problem. George Will said, quote, "That's not what took care of gin. John Wesley took care of gin. We need several John Wesleys," unquote. So Frank, is a portion of dealing with America's kind of ill temperament now, is a portion of the solution not political, but social or spiritual?
Or possibly intellectual. So since I am an intellectual, I feel bound to defend the role of intellectuals in public life. And
Right.
You can see a lot of examples of this. For example, the Reagan Revolution was underpinned by a revolution in economics that was led by people like Milton Friedman and Gary Becker and a lot of these very powerful, academically respectable Chicago school economists that defended free markets and so forth. And over the next 30 years, a lot of the policies did not come from the grassroots. They came from, people that were very smart and tried to work these things out in principle. One thing that is kind of notable about the current American right is that they don't have a real intellectual base. The Claremont Institute has been, I think, sort of floundering around trying to market itself as, the heavyweight intellectual underpinning for Trumpism. And I think it's come out, really incoherently. And it does mean that there's going to be a longer term weakness in this movement because it really isn't going to be based on a kind of coherent set of ideas. And So maybe that does give a little bit too much importance to, to intellectuals, but I do think that in the end, ideas count in politics, even if you don't see the immediate impact.
Let's talk maybe about generational change. In 2018, Frank, you interviewed Yascha Mounk at the Commonwealth Club. And one thing that really has stuck with me from that program was a study that he cited about the declining devotion to democracy in the United States, generation by generation. So from the greatest generation through the millennials, there was a steadily declining importance given to democracy and to living in a democracy, and a growing openness even to military rule. And I guess I keep thinking of that every time you kind of get the response of, oh, the young people are going to save us. It's like the young people, according to that survey, would hit democracy over the head with a shovel at this point. Is anyone optimistic? I see it. I'm starting to sound like JVL, Tim. I'm pretty pessimistic. But what are some reasons for optimism? Let's put it that way. That America will be able to come out of this. We've been through Civil War. We've been through, the rise of the KKK, or the re-rise of the resurgence of the KKK in the 1920s and other things. And we've slowly built a stronger democracy and expanded suffrage, and people are, freer and richer. But what are the reasons to be optimistic now?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. We've stacked our institutions in ways that give extra voice and power to activists and extremists. I mean, the spread of political primaries in both parties is a great example of that. You wouldn't have had the Tea Party if you hadn't had the shift to popular primaries. And, well, California, that's a whole nother Commonwealth Club panel. We've got all these populist measures like initiatives and recalls and so forth that really do not work as advertised. And I do think that there are some institutional changes that you could imagine that would actually moderate our politics. I am in favor of getting rid of our first past the post voting system and replacing it either with ranked choice voting or with, going all the way to proportional representation, which I think would actually create very, very different incentives for politicians that would not drive them to the extremes, but, force them more to the center. The other thing is that we are living in a political age dominated by activists and by, people that take extreme positions. There's still a fairly large number of people in the middle that are not so politicized. And I think that, if you can find the politician that can really appeal to that group, I think you've still got a political base for fixing at least some of the worst excesses that we've seen in the last few years.
How about you, Tim? Reasons for optimism?
I was looking for the optimism there in that answer. I was like, maybe we'll find a politician. I'm pretty pessimistic in general. So this is a bit of a stretch, but my number one reason for optimism is that a lot of our biggest threats are related to the psychological pathologies of one insane person. And like for all of the other, I think that Trump was both symptom and cause. I think the Republican Party has a lot of other deep-seated flaws that aren't related to him. But like our most existential threats are really related to him and his complete lack of shame. It's hard to imagine, even like a Ron DeSantis type, like having the shamelessness that Trump did to, pretend as if to go on for years, pretending as if he had won an election that he knew he lost. I mean, this is the superpower of narcissism and shame that not a lot of people share. So that's one reason for optimism is that hopefully by continuing to isolate this one person at his little golf club, we can move on to fixing other problems. As far as the next generation, so my Snapchat show is targeted to like Zoomers, right? And so I hear a lot from Zoomers. I'm getting old myself, so I definitely am not of this clique. But I have some concerns about the trends looking forward. There is some anti-democratic trends. Like these folks that did not live through the Cold War, they do not share the fear of communism, socialism that we do. So there are a lot of concerns there. But there is a deep sense of like desire for justice. There is the diversity, the demographic change within that cohort is strong, and I think that's helpful. So while I am not sure that we have in store for us like a reversion towards the type of comity that we saw where the two parties people used to complain that they weren't even that they were too similar, right? I don't think we're looking at a reversion of that, but I wouldn't just throw in the towel on the younger generation. I think that there are going to be some political texts they have that are going to be uncomfortable and scary for folks that lived through different eras. But I do think that there's an abiding sense of a desire for justice. I do not think that this is a cohort that's going to want to exacerbate fascistic rule.
Interesting. You mentioned the parties unable to tell them or be told apart. In the 1960s, my father was a pastor of Methodist churches down in South Central Wisconsin. He had two small churches, filled them up every week. And so he was asked to run for Congress. And he was telling me this years later. I wasn't even alive at the time. And he was saying, I was pretty sure I could win, but, he was a pastor of two small churches. He couldn't have afforded it. But he said, I don't remember which party it was. Could have been the Republicans. It could have been the Democrats. In South Central Wisconsin at that time, they both would have been roughly centrist parties. Melissa,
I just want to just jump in and say this isn't really about the younger generation who, I don't envy in so many ways, but I will say this, and it's not been a perfect 5 years or so since President Trump was inaugurated, but the system has worked in a lot of ways, right? I remember when he was elected being in the newsroom and people going, oh my God, like this is it. Like this is, it's over. But it wasn't, right? There are checks on the president's power that both sort of kept things going despite whatever was happening in the Oval Office. And again, not perfect. I think a lot of people wish he had not been elected, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the institutions held, the judicial system held, our legislatures held, and now we've seen this horrible thing happen on January 6th, but people are being prosecuted. There's a committee. It's rolling slowly, but maybe they feel like they have to in order to make sure they don't sort of kick the beehive and try to make sure they've got a lot of evidence for whatever it is that they do. But things are happening the way they're supposed to happen in terms of people being held accountable and people's powers being limited, even President Biden's powers being limited. Like, assuming you think that he was improperly appointed as president, he doesn't actually have the power to change every single person's life in meaningful ways, right? He's circumscribed, right? So you still have your legislature, you still have your Senate, you still have your judiciary to make sure, even if you don't think that person is legitimately elected, that they can't do too much harm to you because of the way our system is set up. So I would just say that for me, and again, I'm not thrilled with the way everything has been going. I don't think it's been awesome, but I do think that the skeleton that we have in terms of our balance of powers and our separation has been largely keeping things on track.
Okay, so an exit question for each of you, or for all of you, the same question, but we'll start with you, Frank. If 2024 comes along, and well, first of all, if 2024 even happens, but let's assume it happens, there's an election, and the Republican nominee, possibly Donald Trump, doesn't win, and in other words, there's an opportunity to try something like this again. Are we better prepared to handle it? Or are the forces who would go along with that going to be in a stronger position because they've had their trial run? The next time, so to speak, do you think we're better prepared for that?
Well, the people that would perpetrate that kind of election fraud are, as we speak, getting much better prepared. It was very amateurish when it happened after November 2020, but the next time around, they're going to have their people in all these key positions like, Raffensperger in Georgia is going to be replaced by a Trump loyalist, and they'll just be more experienced and they'll know what to anticipate. And so I think in that sense, they'll be much better prepared. But the opponents are going to be better prepared too. They're going to be anticipating this. And that's what really is frightening about that situation, because, there's real possibilities for violence, certainly for really mass mobilization of people very, very angry at each other. And I think that that's really what worries a lot of people. Not that we'll have civil war, that's very hard to imagine, but we could have violence, and we could descend into something looking much more like the 60s with, political assassinations and so forth. So that, is something really to watch and to be very vigilant for.
Melissa, your take on the next time.
Well, I, of course, agree with everything Dr. Fukuyama just said, but I also think that, I don't know about y'all, but for me, I was here actually literally sitting right where I am right now doing some work when my husband came in and said that people were attacking the Capitol. Now, I'm not on Twitter, he is, and I thought it was just more like Twitter hyperbole where everything's a big deal. And so I was like, yeah, whatever, that sounds like some Twitter stuff. So I was really shocked when I came and he goes, come look. And so there's, like everyone else, I was watching on CNN or whatever you were watching it on, and going, I can't believe this is actually real. And I think I'm not the only one who sort of didn't think that was possible, right? That, people can leave crappy comments all over Facebook if they want or tweet things, but this is, IRL, as the kids would say, this is an actual attack. And I think for a lot of Americans, we were surprised that this was even something on the table. And so now that it is on the table, it's not just like the, party extremists who are prepared and feel vigilant about this. But I think a lot of even nonpartisan people or people who, consider themselves a little more moderate, are also concerned about the integrity of the elections. And so I think, the hope is that people will pay attention to what's happening in terms of election laws and other things. And so, when someone says we're going to go, change this, we're going to stop this, people take that more seriously, maybe report it to the authorities, in the world that we live in now, where that's a thing that can happen.
And Tim, the final response.
Now we're in my wheelhouse. I think we're much worse prepared, not optimism. I think that both of those were rosy assessments. I think that the Republicans are likely to have a very big year in 2022. And I think that will sweep in a lot of people who are much more amenable to going along with something like what happened in 2020. To Frank's point, not just Georgia, but all these other states, secretaries of states, local House of Representatives, and I think that the types of people who are not likely to go along with it are right now being pushed out of the party and are going to find themselves losing primary campaigns. I think that we, got lucky that Biden won basically like a series of coin flips. Like he won 3 states very close. He won 7 million popular vote, but 3 states were very, very close. Had 2 of those coin flips gone the other way, and had it only been, say, Georgia last time, rather than 3 states that needed to be flipped, I think we would have been in a much more serious situation. I think we still would have held, because at that time, Democrats, had the House and various places. I don't think they're going to. Republicans are going to have the House and the Senate next time. I think they'll control most of these state houses. They'll control most of these secretaries of states. And so if it ends up being a close election, I think that we are headed straight down a path to a constitutional crisis that could lead to street violence. And, who knows? It wouldn't be till it wouldn't be look like anything since 1876. I hope that doesn't happen. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but I think that the percentage chance that happens is much, much higher than we should feel comfortable with.
Well, on that cheery note, we have come to the end of our program. For those of you who tuned in expecting to learn more about the NFL playoffs, sorry about that. However, if you want to know more about the January 6th insurrection, as well as ongoing efforts related to that, you can watch our live stream today at 3 p.m. Pacific time, featuring the Atlantic writer Barton Gilman discussing his reporting on the insurrection. I want to thank our excellent panel today, Melissa Cain, Dr. Francis Fukuyama, and Tim Miller, for a great conversation about January 6th, past, present, and future. Thanks to all of you for listening and watching online. Stay safe and stay healthy. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.